morning. Since I'm on the topic of Christ consciousness and archetypal stories that match the Christ story, or even a second coming kind of idea, or thousandth coming, whatever you want to count to at this point, because there's been so many heroes that have stood up and even to their deaths to bring us this world that we have now, that we have to thank each one of them. And we don't know all their names, but there's a lot of them, tens of thousands, true warriors. One I can think of that's really important in our Canadian history is Riel. Riel, he's an example of what it looked like in the prairies and towards British Columbia and Alberta and Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and it was a different story than what we hear. We don't hear a lot about the 1800s, and there was a great reset right after that. After we had the War of 1812, and then they fought with the natives. The U.S. was fighting against British and Canadian natives to save their land, and the British promised them that they could just live in peace beside each other, and they got to take their land. Well, they never got their land, and that fight still continued on. And as they moved across Canada, they ran into a lot of resistance, and the Red River Rebellion was like one of the last kind of where it had to get bloody, and because the British were coming in and taking over Canada, and were still taken over by them. And if we want to know that story, we have to know too that Riel was a very religious man, very spiritual. He read the book Spiritual Before Religious too, because he acted in his spirit. And people that are connected to a certain consciousness, which he was, they can either take it and hide away and maybe write books and stuff like that, which is good too, because it'll get passed on, or you can get involved with your local government and try to change things so that your children and your children's children will have a future, right? So he was a part of politics, and he was so he tried to fix it from the inside. He wasn't just he did all the steps to try to keep freedom in Canada, and none of that would work. So that was also when they pretty much made it so you couldn't be a part of Canada unless you started to take the British mark, right? So it's a kind of little mark of the beast story too, right? So, and he eventually became a problem for the new Canadian British government that was taking over the true Canada, which was people living in, especially a lot of natives and French and different people were living together in peace, in staying on their own areas, and it was working for people, right? And they talk about all this warfare between the natives and and white people and stuff like that. Well, there's times of peace too in the 1800s. Riel is an example of that. He was a person connected to these communities, and he was probably only about 16th native, maybe an 8th native, right? So it just shows you what that story is a story of unity, where we came together to try to fight against an evil, right? And to realize there was a common enemy. And so he ended up having to run away from the Canadian government because he was too much of a problem for them. He was a very intelligent person. He was able to really intellectualize what he needed to say to try to protect the land. And so he became like he had to run out of the country at one point, and he had to hide in the U.S. and I believe that's where he started a family. I might be wrong there, but he came back up, and he had a what they called a mental breakdown. And what I would call it is that he had a Kundalini awakening. And when that happens, you have this intense understanding of things and you don't know where it came from. It's like a snap connection to the collective consciousness, and it becomes it can cause an effect where you confuse yourself with the collective consciousness. And so you'll hear a lot of people that have these experiences think that they are God, or they're Christ, or they're they're not Christ, but they are experiencing a deep connection to Christ consciousness. So it becomes confusing. And he was saying that he was the reincarnation of David from the Bible, King David, and so people were a little confused about that. And so he also, well, the crazy thing is the story does kind of match King David's story, because he had to run and hide away from the local government at the time too, in the story of King David, right? So before he became king. So the reason that, and then during this time of his Kundalini awakening, or his let's say lost his mind, as people, he probably lost one mind but gained another. He gave $2,000 to a beggar on the side of the road, and that was one of the, because they were already like, well, what's he talking about with this? He got really religious and started to talk about like that he had a mission kind of thing from God, in a sense, right? And people do get missions from God, and so people were confused. And then he gave away $2,000, and then his friend tricked him into and then he got locked into the mental institution for 2 years. I'll tell you, it's very interesting, like how once a person has that message from God, there's nothing stopping somebody like that. And when a government is scared, is really scared of somebody that's fearless like that, right? And he was a problem for the colonization from Britain, so it's interesting how he wasn't harming anybody with his religious, like his awakening. He was giving out $2,000 to somebody because he had obviously extra, you know what I mean? And that seemed crazy. There's other things that made him seem crazy, but the lock away for 2 years is more, it seems like to me, is to keep somebody that's very dangerous to their movement away, and that's part of the witch hunt, right? So yeah, we have to be very careful with how we look at things, because after he got out, he spent 2 years writing religious poetry and philosophy, and when he came out, he became one of our renowned heroes in the last, and the story is he fought again. They had to fight and bring it to blood, and that was called the Red River Rebellion. And after that, he was tracked down in Batoche, where my grandfather was born, and he was hung for treason, and the story was called I learned it in school as the Red River Massacre, right? And as I grew up, I realized it was the Red River Rebellion. So what side of history is our education system, right? And if you look at that story, he gave his life for the freedom of the people that were living in that land, right? And when we look at like the ripples in time and what that story has done, we have to realize that he was in a mission. We're all here for a purpose. We don't always know what our purpose is, or we're, instead of following our purpose, we're usually guided by somebody else's purpose, and like the the Babylon system is an example of that. If you're on the clock of Babylon, you may be outside of your purpose, and that's what might be that anxiety that's pulling on you, right? But we all have purpose, and he had a Kundalini awakening that probably showed him some visions of what, because this is what happens when this happens. You start to see things and watch connections, and you're like, oh, you start to see almost the future happening in your mind. And he saw this stuff happening, and he like reacted in any, he was confused himself with the collective consciousness, but his story ended up coming true. So, he was a prophet. He also, these are people that are sent here. They become, for lack of a better word, enlightened, and start see things that are out of the norms. And because of that, it seems like black magic or witchery or just insanity. You know what I mean? And so, I see so many absolutely crazy people on Baker Street that are literally a problem for community safety and their own safety, and I see them not getting helped. And certain people that can be a problem for certain situations, they're the ones that are locked away, right? So I think Louis Riel knew what he needed to do, and he did it for us, so we should praise him in that Christ story also. So thank you, Louis Riel. Thank you, Gabriel Lamont. Anyways, I forget his captain, but everyone that was involved, all the people that fought beside him, they all are heroes to me, And I know his army, he had many powerful Métis and non-Métis and native warriors behind him fighting those battles, and they all got run off their land, and a lot of them ended up in northern Alberta. That's what I hear. So we can look to these northern communities, and they're all these native communities and what stories they have. Go right back to the truthful people, because we need to start finding out what the true history of Canada is, and we don't know much before Louis Riel was hung. We don't know much truth before that, that's for sure. So praise God, praise Jesus, praise Haile Selassie, praise Ekebeka. Praise all the people in your life that got you to where you are. And in this story, praise Louis Riel. And he was a powerful force. He was David versus Goliath. So, thank you, reincarnation of King David. Much love.